Hello, my name is Shadow Nuking, and today I am here to talk all things Sevagoth. This is probably one of the most comprehensive Sevagoth guides you'll find because no one really talks about him at all. And even his wiki page actually has not a lot of information on his kit, which forced me to actually do quite a bit of testing on his kit to make a good video for you guys with decent information. So I do hope you enjoyed for the effort I put into this video, as this video took a lot of effort because one thing I learned about Sevagoth is he is very good at wrecking my recording setup. Yes, the thing about Sevagoth is he's become a very good nuker in his age, and he causes a lot of explosions, which was very hard on my recording setup, which led me to basically redesign all of my recording setup and having to like change the settings in OBS, and hopefully now my setup will be much better going forward in the future anyway. But yes, thank you Sevagoth for that one. Also, he has so many explosions going on half the time with my nuking build. I don't even see what I'm doing myself, so I don't blame OBS for freaking out. Honestly, half the time I'm just watching the minimap to see where enemies are because I can't see them myself and I don't know what's going on. Yeah, there are a lot of explosions. Anyway, let's talk a bit more about Sevagoth. So Sevagoth honestly is actually one of my favorite Warframes in terms of theming, and when he originally came out I immediately fell in love with him, but I haven't really used him that much as I got on because Sevagoth for a very long time was pretty bad, honestly, and he had an amazing helmet ability and annoying grind to get him, so most people just only grinded for him once to get his helmet ability and then didn't touch him ever again, which is probably why his wiki doesn't have a lot of information on it. However, Sevagoth very recently has gotten 2 augments and have made him a much better Warframe, and he's actually one of the best nukers in the game now. And now we just got Sevagoth Prime, and so we're going to talk about Sevagoth, and I have 3 builds to show you. 2 for Sevagoth himself and 1 for his Exalted Shadow, which I will get to in a second. But yeah, Sevagoth is honestly one of my favorite Warframes, probably my favorite Warframe when it comes to theme. He's like a Grim Reaper ghost pirate dude. And he has a really unique kit because he has an Exalted Warframe, which is the Exalted Shadow. So you could liken Sevagoth to Equinox because the way Equinox works is she has 2 different forms, and her abilities will do 2 different things depending on which form she's in. Sevagoth works similarly because you have Sevagoth, which has his own set of abilities. Then you have the Exalted Shadow, which also has his own set of abilities. However, unlike Equinox, Sevagoth's Exalted Shadow is actually a different Warframe. It is an Exalted Warframe. That is to say, it has its own stats, its own modding area, meaning it can have its different duration, strength, and range to normal Sevagoth, as an example. And also the Exalted Shadow doesn't use any of Sevagoth's weapons, but instead it makes use of its own exalted weapon, the Shadow Claws. So without further delay, let's get into Sevagoth's actual abilities, starting with his passive. When Sevagoth gets downed, instead of being downed like a normal Warframe, he does his best Inaros impersonation by going into a tomb. However, until Inaros' rework, this passive was a lot better than Inaros', but now Inaros is a lot better now. In this tomb, you will be given control over Sevagoth's Exalted Shadow, but other players will still be able to revive you as normal. The Exalted Shadow, however, is a bit different to what it is normally, as you are unable to use the Shadow Claws, nor are you able to use any of the Exalted Shadow's abilities except for his second ability, which is called Consume. When in this state, you must kill 5 enemies with Consume in order to self-revive yourself before your bleed out timer runs out. Do be warned though, however, the Exalted Shadow does still have a health bar. It is not immune during this phase, and if the Exalted Shadow himself gets downed, you will be forced into your bleed out state and either have to force revive or have someone else revive you by how they normally would when you are bleeding out. Also, just like in Naros, this ability does override Last Grasp, so you cannot use Last Grasp on Sevagoth. Using the regular primary fire / secondary fire weapon melee button or actual consumes ability button will cast Consume. Additionally, Consume does work a bit differently when in the state, but briefly, what does Consume actually do? Basically, Consume has the Exalted Shadow launched forward at enemies, and when it hits enemies, it does a bit of damage. When in this state of the Sevagoth Exalted Shadow, the ability will do 100% of the damage the ability does will be equal to 100% of the enemy's health, and it will ignore armor and shields. Essentially, it will one-shot all enemies except bosses and other priority targets. Sevagoth also technically has another passive called the Death Well, which is a unique graphical interface which is above Sevagoth's energy power that has specific synergies with all of Sevagoth's abilities and also relates to the Exalted Shadow. However, if you have your fourth ability, Helmet's Off, which I will explain why this happens later on, if you have the fourth ability, Helmet's Off, this graphical interface will no longer appear, as it is no longer needed. Sevagoth's first ability is called Reap. Reap will summon the Shadow to fight alongside you for 6 seconds. When enemies are within range of the Shadow, it will send out a howl, dealing radiation damage while also activating one of its abilities, Death's Harvest. Death's Harvest places the Death's Harvest debuff on enemies, which will make enemies 50% weaker to all sources of damage. This does scale off power strength. When enemies that are inflicted by Death's Harvest die, the Death Well will be filled by 5%. Aiming while the ability is activated will cause the Shadow to change directions and go towards where you aimed. If you hold the aim, the Shadow's speed will increase. This ability does have one of the two augments I referred to earlier, the augment for this ability does 2 things. First of all, enemies that are affected by the Reap's Howl will also have a debuff or buff, however you want to call it, placed on them that will give you an absolute crit chance buff of 50%, scaling off power strength. Essentially, shooting enemies that have been inflicted with Death's Harvest by Reap will give you a 50% absolute crit chance buff. What does an absolute crit chance buff mean? Well, it means it is a flat number that is added to your crit chance after mods. So say you have a weapon with a 100% crit chance with mods, the 50% absolute crit chance buff will then increase your critical chance to 150%. And this crit chance buff does scale off power strength, so if you had 200% power strength, for example, you would get 200% crit chance, and so on and so on the more power strength you have. Additionally, when you kill an enemy infected by Death's Harvest, you will spawn a new instance of Reap. And you will be able to have up to 3 instances of Reap currently activated. Reap typically cannot activate its Howl, inflicting enemies with Death's Harvest, on enemies already inflicted with Death's Harvest. However, the new instances of it will be able to do so. I'm not sure if the actual crit chance buff will stack on each instance of Reap. I believe it does, but I can't tell you for certain. However, the radiation damage that Reap does, which is minimal, as well as Death's Harvest itself, will stack. Sevagoth's second ability is called Sow. Sow will place a damage over time on enemies within 16 meters, dealing true damage. That's it. That's literally it. Enemies that are killed while Sow is activated will fill the Death Well by 5%. While that's the only thing Sow does, it does, however, have additional synergy with Reap, as, of course, you reap what you sow. Casting Reap on enemies inflicted by Sow will deal 25% of their health as true damage to them, and an additional 25% of their health as blast damage to themselves and all other enemies within a 4-meter AoE. However, Reap can only activate this explosion once per instance, but if you have the augment for Reap, allowing for up to 3 instances of the ability, it will cause 3 separate instances of this explosion. This ability also has an augment. This augment makes it so killing enemies inflicted by Sow will spread the effect of Sow to new enemies within 15 meters. Essentially, using these 2 augments together set off a chain reaction which is what has made Sevagoth such an amazing nuker. As you'll inflict enemies with Sow, then cast Reap on them, setting off the explosion, killing those enemies, spreading Sow to new enemies, which of course reactivates the explosion, summoning new instances of Reap, and spreading Sow to new enemies, killing more enemies, summoning new instances of Reap, spreading Sow to, and so on and so on and so on. Chain reaction. It doesn't always work, as you need to have like a line of enemies set up in order to actually have the chain reaction set off, as you would imagine, but once it does work, it is a glorious thing to see. And even if you don't get the full effect of the chain reaction, it will still nuke a crowd of enemies very effectively. Sevagoth's third ability is called Gloom, and it is Sevagoth's Helminth ability, and it is one of the best Helminth abilities in the entire game. Casting this ability creates a 4-meter aura around Sevagoth that expands to 60 meters once the ability is initially casted, very quickly. This aura is centered on Sevagoth and will follow him wherever he goes. Enemies that are within the aura will be slowed by 35%, and that does scale off power strain. Additionally, whenever Sevagoth or any Warframe that's also in the aura, including the Exalted Shadow himself, shoot or hit an enemy with a melee weapon, they will have lifesteal applied to their attack by 5%. This means their hits heal you. All your hits will heal you. The ability is a channeled ability, meaning it does drain energy over time. However, the energy drain on the ability is dependent on how many enemies are currently within the aura. If there are no enemies in the aura, the ability will not drain any energy. However, the more enemies in the aura, the more energy that will drain, capping out at 7.5 energy per second. While Gloom is activated, the damage that both Reap and Sow do will heal Sevagoth. Each enemy that is alive within the aura will fill the death well by 0.1% per second. Sevagoth's fourth ability is Exalted Shadow. Essentially, it transfers control over to the Exalted Shadow as if you would whenever you go into your operator. The ability itself does not cost any energy while it is activated, nor does it drain any energy. However, it will drain the death well while it is activated. And you must have at least 75% of the death well filled or more in order to cast the ability. When the death well runs out, Sevagoth will be teleported to your location and you'll gain back control of him. If you die as the Shadow, however, you will gain back control of Sevagoth, but you will be teleported to where you left him. If the death well is still 75% filled or more when the Shadow dies, you can immediately recast the ability. The Shadow is immune to damage for a short period of time when the ability is first cast. Operator passives do not work on the Shadow, nor can you go into your operator when you're in the Shadow. If you attempt to go into your operator when you're in the Shadow, you will go into your operator, but upon re-entering your Warframe, you'll re-enter Sevagoth, not the Shadow, and you'll have to recast Exalted Shadow instead. Mods such as Amalgam's Serration on Sevagoth's weapon do not transfer over to the Shadow. You cannot put any helmets on the Shadow. However, some good news, your companion will still follow you while on the Shadow, and Archon Shards that are on Sevagoth do affect the Shadow. Additionally, when you're in the Shadow, you cannot use any of Sevagoth's weapons, but instead you will only be able to use the Exalted Shadow's exalted weapon, the Shadow's Claws. Lastly, I did mention that the Exalted Shadow can benefit from the lifesteal from Gloom. If Gloom is activated when you cast Exalted Shadow, Gloom will remain active while you are in the Exalted Shadow, and if you are within the aura of Gloom, you will get that lifesteal on the Exalted Shadow. However, Gloom will be centered on Sevagoth, not the Exalted Shadow, meaning you will be able to leave its radius. Additionally, while the ability won't deactivate, it will still drain Sevagoth's energy, and you can go back to Sevagoth with no energy, so I would advise against it. So, what is the Exalted Shadow all about? Well, the Exalted Shadow does have more armor and has a faster movement speed than Sevagoth, but does have less shield and less energy. It actually has one of the smallest shield values in the game. The Shadow does not have a passive, however, you can consider the Exalted Claws as a passive of some sort, like Garuda's Exalted Talons are one of her passives. The Shadow Claws do have a 50% slash weighting, a 36% crit chance, a 2.6 crit multiplier, and a 24% status chance with forced slash procs on its neutral combo and forced impact procs on basically all combos. The Claws do scale off Sevagoth's strength, not the Exalted Shadow Strength, as well as the mods you put in it like any normal Exalted. Just like any normal Exalted, you cannot put either Blood Rush or Weeping Runes on the Shadow. However, you will be able to make use of the full Gladiator melee mods by putting them all on your melee on Sevagoth and then putting Gladiator Might on the Shadow, which will give you 30% crit chance per combo. However, I would still recommend against it, as building combo with the Shadow, especially with the build I will show you, can be a bit annoying. The Shadow's first ability is called Embrace. Embrace will pull enemies in front of Shadow within 20 meters in an 80-degree cone, grouping them right together right in front of where you initially cast the ability, just like how Pull on Mag works. It is a grouping ability, and it is a pretty good grouping ability. Consume is the Shadow's second ability, and we are already familiar with it from Sevagoths Passive. Consume will launch the Shadow forward, as I already discussed. However, in this version, it is not a one-shot kill, nor will it ignore shields and armor. Instead, it will do radiation damage, but it will also heal the Shadow for 25% of the damage it deals to enemies it hits. The Shadow's third ability is Death Harvest, another ability we're already familiar with. It will inflict all enemies within a 12-meter full 360 degrees around Sevagoth, with the effect of Death Harvest, making them weaker to all forms of damage by 50%. The Death Harvest debuff caused by the Shadow is different from the Death Harvest debuff caused by Reap. That is to say that the Death Harvest from Reap scales of Sevagoth's power strength, while Death Harvest on the Shadow scales of the Shadow's power strength. So you can actually have two different percentages for each debuff depending on what your power strength are on Sevagoth and also the Shadow. That's all Death Harvest does for the Shadow. However, both of Sevagoth's augments, the augments for his first and his second, do add additional effects to Death Harvest. Neither augment can be placed on the Shadow, but placing them on Sevagoth himself will apply their additional effects to Death Harvest while you're in your Shadow. The first augment will still spawn additional instances of Reap while you kill an enemy inflicted by Death's Harvest. Immediately casting Death's Harvest will not spawn Reap, but then killing an enemy inflicted by your ability will then spawn an instance of Reap, and then you will be able to further kill enemies to spawn up to 3 instances of Reap. While Death Harvest itself will not face the crit chance buff that you get from Reap with the augment, the Reaps that are spawned from enemies inflicted with Death Harvest will place that crit chance buff. The crit chance buff the Death Harvest effect Reap causes, as well as the duration of Reap, all scale of Sevagoth's power strength and duration, not the Shadow's. The second augment will give Death's Harvest the ability to inflict Sow on enemies upon casting Death's Harvest, and so will still spread to enemies like normal upon killing enemies already inflicted with it. The duration of Slow as well as the range of Sow does scale off Death's Harvest range and duration. With both augments, you effectively allow yourself to nuke with the Shadow, as you'll be able to inflict enemies with Sow by casting Death's Harvest, and then you'll be able to kill one of those enemies summoning an instance of Reap, which will cause the Reap what you Sow explosion. The Exalted Shadow's fourth ability is called Reunite. Basically, it just transfers control back to Sevagoth by teleporting Sevagoth to your current location. It will also heal Sevagoth by 1% of its maximum health pool for each percentage of the death bar that was drained while playing as the Exalted Shadow. Okay, now onto the builds. As I said, I have 3 builds here for you today: a Nuking Sevagoth build, a Weapon Platform Sevagoth build, and then a Nuking Exalted Shadow build. So let's get into it. The Nuking Sevagoth build does use both augments, and the helmet ability is Nourish. I am using Nourish because I found the ability does have quite bad energy. The setup does have quite bad energy economy. However, if you don't have energy economy issues, then I would highly encourage you to use Raw instead of Nourish, as it will result in more damage from the ability. Once upon a time, this setup used to need an armor strip, but ever since the armor caps, the setup no longer needs an armor strip. For the Aura mod, I am using Brief Respite, as this is a shield gate setup. I don't normally like using shield gate setups on too many Warframes, but when a Warframe is naturally casty and going to be casting abilities a lot, like they will be doing on this setup, then shield gating is just a no-brainer, as it is the best form of survivability. To further support the shield gate setup, I am using Catalyzing Shields, which will lower my maximum shield value, making it so one ability cast will fully restore all my shields, and also give me a 1.33 seconds shield gate duration. And of course, we are using Rolling Guard for some extra iframes. I would highly encourage you to actually max out Rolling Guard, unlike what I have done. Additionally, we are using both Blind Rage and Umbral Intensifier for ability strength, which will increase the damage vulnerability that you get from Death Harvest from Reap, which will increase its nuking potential. It will not increase the damage of Reap What You Sow does, as it is at fixed 25% of the enemy's health. Prime Continuity will increase the duration of Nourish, and Prime Flow obviously for the larger energy pool. And then we have both augments, Shadow Hage being the augment for Reap, and Dark, I'm not even going to attempt to say that word, being the augment for Sow. Arcane Energize is again for energy economy, and Arcane Aegis is for some more survivability, giving us some shield regen. While I am showing off Sevagoth in this video, as Sevagoth Prime did just come out, I will also be showing off every single Prime item that came out in Sevagoth Prime Access, including Epitaph Prime. And this build is the build I use Epitaph Prime on. So I use Epitaph Prime as a AoE primer, and the AoE primer build is very simple. We have Amalgam Barrel Diffusion for some utility and also multi-shot. The utility we get there is to increase our dodge speed. Augure's Secret is to increase the duration of the status effects, but also because of the Augur mod set bonus, which Augur Pact is there solely for, because they will give us shield regen on casting and abilities, which is very useful and is additive with Brief Respite. So we use both Augur mods for that reason. Short Shot is of course for some more status chance, and then we have Lethal Torrent for fire rate and also more multi-shots. Then this build is my magnetic build setup. The reason why we're using magnetic on this is because we will be getting viral from Nourish. But if you are not using Nourish, I would highly recommend using the viral setup, which is the exact same build, but instead of using Jolt and Frostbite, which is electricity and cold 60-60 mods, giving us more status chance as well, just replace Jolt with the toxic 60-60 mod instead, swapping out magnetic for viral. And then we do have accelerated isotope, which will give us more fire rate and also radiation. Radiation is a very good status effect when it comes to crowd control, as it will make enemies shoot each other. Epitaph as a whole with this radiation mod is fantastic when it comes to crowd control, as not only will it make enemies shoot each other, but it will also make enemies slow because it force procs cold. Additionally, you will notice I do have 3 formers in my Epitaph. That is solely because of my viral heat, my heat inherent setup. All my other builds, including this one, do not need any former. So you can use this exact same build on any priming setup you want, and then just replace the elements to whichever mod elements you want. However, I highly recommend normally doing radiation and viral, but you might want a viral and electricity for gyro, for example, or magnetic and radiation for when you're using Nourish. Just to give you an example of how powerful of a crowd control ability this is, enemies are slowed, they're attacking each other, none of them are shooting me. Amazing. Cold also increases your critical damage on enemies. Absolutely amazing weapon. Best primer in the game. Look at this. They're shooting each other. They're not shooting me. I have nothing to worry about them. Even as they get unslowed from cold, they're still attacking each other instead of attacking me. Fantastic ability when it comes to crowd control, which does offer a lot of survivability, especially with shield gate setups. The companion we are using for this build is Death Cube. That is because Death Cube is especially good at generating a lot of orbs. So we're using it, that is to say energy and health orbs, so we're using it for energy economy. As I said, this build is very heavy on energy economy. We do have energy generator, which will drop an energy orb on every 10 kill assists. This is a unique mod for Death Cube, which is why we use the setup on Death Cube specifically, as the other 2 mods that create a lot of orbs can be used on any companion. The other one is Duplex Bond, which will summon up to 3 clones of our companion that will go around killing enemies, and each enemy they kill will have a 50% chance to drop energy orbs. So you actually end up getting a lot of energy orbs from this. And since Deconstruct is the next one, enemies inflicted and enemies injured by companions will have a 25% chance, an additional 25% chance to drop health orbs when they die. We're also using Contagion Bond, which will spread the status effects that are placed on enemies each time our companion kills that enemy. Guardian will give us some additional survivability, as while it is off cooldown, whenever our shields break, it will immediately restore our shields. This is a very good mod to have in general, but especially for shield gate setups. Assault mode is necessary on this build as it is used to actually make the companion attack enemies. Without assault mode, sentinels cannot attack enemies. Regen will make it so when the companion does die, instead of being gone for full 60 seconds, it's only gone for 40 seconds. If you have the mod capacity and also prime regen, I would highly encourage you using primed regen instead. I do not have the mod capacity. Enhanced vitality and capillary direction are for the survivability of the companion, and vacuum is a must-have mod. Every companion should have vacuum or fetch. For the companion weapon, we have Verglas Prime, which is the second new other prime item that came in Prime Access. The way you get Verglas Prime is through Nautilus Prime, and I do recommend going after Verglas Prime, as we use Verglas on our companions with DPS because it is really the only companion weapon that is actually capable of any solid DPS. And you get normal while normal Verglas is also still pretty good for DPS, you get normal Verglas through regular Nautilus, and Nautilus Prime is actually easier to get. So Verglas Prime is not only a better weapon, but it will also just be easier to get, so I recommend going after Verglas Prime if you don't already have it. The build on it is pretty simple. We simply just have base damage, faction damage, fire rate, reload speed, and then we have our damage over time setup. Verglas is a very good status weapon, so we are using viral heat. Verglas does have an inherent cold, so you definitely have to run both unranked rim rounds and Malagin Force, and both thermite rounds in a maxed Hellfire in order to actually get more heat than cold, which will make heat proc more often. More heat than viral, which will make heat proc more often than viral for the best form of DPS. Additionally, other utility weapons, I would recommend any rifle you want. However, Lieutenant Glaxon is definitely a good choice because of its augment, which I'm yet to get, so I can't show it off. But also just make sure that you're running Amalgam Serration for the extra movement speed. And then Paretos is another fantastic utility weapon, as because of this evolution right here, which gives you extra sprint speed and slide, and also additional parkour velocity from its 4th evolution. The damage rotation for the first build is simple. Basically, you just want to run around, make sure Nourish is activated at all times, or Roar if you're not using Nourish, and then cast your second ability on enemies, and then cast your first ability on enemies inflicted with your second. They will blow up and just rinse and repeat. That's basically all you want to do. And then you also want to be using Epitaph to prime enemies and also giving you that crowd control, giving you that extra bit of survivability. Roll as necessary to cleanse yourself of status effects, and also to give you iframes with Rolling Guard. And make sure to pay attention to what your shields are at, so you can cast either your first or second ability, which will fully restore your shields if your shields run out. Next up, we have the Weapon Platform build. The Weapon Platform build uses the first augment for the extra crit chance for our shots. Additionally, we will be using a Roar as the helmet ability, as we will be using a damage over time build on the weapon we are using. This setup does work on any weapon you want, however, I have picked a specific weapon for theming reasons. However, by no means is it the best weapon for the setup. In fact, you can definitely do a lot better than this weapon. If you instead choose to go for a raw damage setup instead of a damage over time setup, I would recommend doing Xata's Whisper instead of Raw, as it is a much better damage buff for raw damage setups. Raw is only better than Xata's Whisper for damage over time because it is a faction damage buff and does double dip with status effects. So first, the actual Sevagoth build. I am using Rifle Amp. It does give your rifle additional damage, and I am using Rifle as my DPS weapon, but really you can run whatever aura you want, it really doesn't matter. Adaptation for survivability, as this is a health tank setup, and we are using vitality as well. For our power strength, we are using Blind Rage and Umbra Intensify once again, Streamline as well to offsuit some of Blind Rage's negative effect, Prime Continuity to increase the duration of Raw, Primed Flow for some energy economy, and Shadow Haze, which is the first augment for Reap to give us that crit chance buff. We are using Arcane Blessing for the extra 1200 health at max strength upon picking up 50 health orbs to give us up to 1800 health for the proper health tank setup, and Arcane Energize of course for extra energy economy. This setup is simple. We simply have Raw activated all the time, and then we use Gloom activated all the time as well for survivability, both by slowing enemies and to heal, to give us the healing required to maintain a health tank setup. And then we cast Reap as needed in order to inflict enemies with both that damage vulnerability, making them weaker to all forms of our damage, and also that crit chance buff. The weapon we are using for this build is the Kluver Chakra. As I said, it is not the best weapon for the setup. I just thought it was fitting to use the Kivachakal, as it is a flintlock rifle and Sevagoth is a pirate. Any weapon could work on the setup, it is entirely up to you, and the build you would use on a weapon would be pretty similar to this because most weapon builds are basically the same. So what are we doing? We are using Galvanized Scope for the multi-shot. We have critical delay for the critical chance, and we have our crit damage from violence. Internal bleeding will have a 35% chance to inflict slash upon enemies whenever we inflict the impact stats effects. This effect is doubled. We have a double chance of this happening if our fire rate is lower than 2.5, and you'll notice that is exactly what we have. Meaning we actually have a 70% chance to inflict slash on enemies whenever we inflict impact on them, and the Kivachakal does have a forced impact status effect. We also do have fast hands and radiation reload plus primary merciless for reload speed, as the Kivachakal's reload speed is absolutely atrocious, and I went all out on it. If you have primed fast hand, unlike me, I would recommend using it on this weapon. I wish I had it because the reload speed on this weapon is truly terrible. And of course we do have speed trigger for additional fire rate. I have Malignant Force, that is because this is a Kuva weapon, so I intended to get cold on the weapon through the Kuva Lich system. That is because I figured cold would be good, as it can be used to make viral, which I'm using right now with Malignant Force, as well as Blast and Magnetic, which are all really good damage types right now. Toxic is another really good damage type you can go for the Kuva system, as you can use it to make viral. Corrosive, which is less good but still pretty good, and also Gas, which again is less good. Toxic definitely used to be the go-to, but ever since Jade Shadows, I actually kind of think Cold is a better damage type to go for Kuva weapons, but we'll see. The great thing about this weapon is it is an AoE, and it does force proc impact, and what the impact status effect does is stagger enemies. And since Gloom is a complete animation slow, this also means the stagger on the enemies is slow. Meaning, just by shooting enemies, you get a level of crowd control, kind of like what you would get from Epitaph. As you can see, the enemy is slowed just from one shot, and look how long it is taking for them to recover from the slow. None of these enemies are yet to actually recover from the slow. And the impact status effect will also be implying slash on them, which is where our main source of DPS is coming from. The companion we're using for this build, and the last prime item that came in Sevagoth Prime Access, is the Nautilus Prime, the companion that comes with Verglas Prime. Nautilus Prime has a very cool effect, which is Cordon, one of its preset mods, which will group enemies. The other preset mod for Nautilus Prime is nothing you need to worry about. Guardian is still used in this setup, even as it is a health tank setup. That is because I use Nautilus Prime for other Warframes as well, but also the regen to your shield is still extra survivability, so it's very nice. Manifold Bond will be used to spread status effects onto enemies upon each ability cast, as well as lowering the duration of our abilities, making Cordon a lot more effective. Momentumous Bond will reduce the recovery time of our companion when it dies by 18 seconds each time you kill an Xmas unit. Additionally, when you do kill an Xmas unit, we will give an additional random damage type to our companion weapon, which means more status effects for Manifold Bond. Cathode Redirection, as well as Enhanced Vitality, is for the survivability of the companion. Synth Deconstruct is just a fantastic utility mod to have, dropping extra health orbs, as well as giving us reload while hosted on our weapons. Primed Regen, so instead of 60 seconds respawn time when the companion dies, it's only 31 seconds. That goes up even more if you actually max it out, unlike me. Assault mode is necessary again because you need it for the companion to actually attack enemies, and then of course a vacuum must-have mod. The weapon we are using on Nautilus Prime is the Hellstrom. Why Hellstrom? Hellstrom is a very good priming weapon for Sentinels. It fires out multiple rocket launches with a very high status chance, making it very good for priming. As you can see, I have modded it to have viral, electric, and radiation with priming. We do have Vigilance for multi-shot as well as the chamber. For more multi-shot equals more status effects for more priming. Speed trigger, of course, to make it faster. Rifle aptitude for status chance. Radiation, viral plus status chance, and also electricity plus status chance. I would recommend actually formering Hellstrom and putting on max speed trigger and Vigilant augmented, but hey, what can you do? Once again, I use the same utility weapons as I used on my last build. We use Epitaph with Amalgam Barrel Diffusion for the rolling speed and Kratos. The last build is the Sevagoth Exalted Shadow Nuke build. So for the Exalted Shadow build, we are using a variation of the Sevagoth Nuking build in order to actually build up the Death Well, because before we can even get into the Exalted Shadow, we do need to build up the Death Well, and the Sevagoth Nuke build fills up the Death Well very, very quickly. However, it is altered slightly because we are running very low duration, which I'll explain why once we get to the Shadow build. But the build does use Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify, and Transient Fortitude for power strength, meaning it actually does have more power strength than the regular nuke build, giving us a larger crit chance buff for our Exalted Claws and more damage vulnerability from enemies inflicted by Death's Harvest from Reap. And then you're also using Transient Fortitude as well as Fleeting Expertise for the negative duration. While we do benefit from the extra efficiency from Fleeting Expertise, the reasoning behind using it is for the negative duration, not for the efficiency. This gives us a 0.1 second on the duration of Reap itself and a 1.5 second on the Death's Harvest debuff from Reap. We are using Catalyzed Shield for additional survivability. Unfortunately, I did not have the mod slots to fit on Rolling Guard. And we are also using Prime Flow for some energy economy. Shadow Haze and, of course, the Augment for the second ability are needed. Arcane Aegis for some additional survivability and Arcane Energize for energy economy. We are using Steel Charger solely for the extra mod capacity, and also I do think aura mods from Sevagoth do actually affect the Exalted Shadow, which means this will give us some additional melee damage for our claws, but I'm not entirely sure on that, so do not quote me. Now for the Exalted Shadow build, finally. So the issue with nuking with the Exalted Shadow versus nuking with Sevagoth himself is because while Sevagoth can simply just cast Reap, the Shadow can't. The Shadow needs to kill enemies in order for Reap to spawn. And the issue with this is you cannot have more than 3 instances of Reap activated at any time. Killing an enemy when there are already 3 instances of Reap activated will not spawn a new instance. Sevagoth doesn't have to worry about this, as you can always respawn Reap by simply recasting the ability. But if you have a high duration on Reap with the Shadow, you won't be able to spawn the additional instances of Reap on each kill, making the nuking a lot less effective, which is why we have such little duration on Sevagoth. That way, we only have a 0.9 second duration on Reap, essentially guaranteeing us to always have being able to summon an instance of Reap to set off the chain reaction and nuke from and Reap when we kill an enemy by inflicting them with Death's Harvest. The Shadow also suffers from many other issues, mainly relating to its survivability. While it actually does have a decent amount of armor, it has very little health. It doesn't really work well with Arcane Blessing, so we can't rely on Arcane Blessing for health. The reason being is because if we do die as the Shadow, we'll have to rebuild up Arcane Blessing. If we run out of Death Swell or use our 4th ability to go back into Sevagoth, Arcane Blessing will stay at whatever we left it at when we go back into the Shadow, but we can't completely rely on that as you're more than likely to die. Because of this, I have relied on committing some pretty bad sins when it comes to Sevagoth's Prime Shadow, just to give it some basic level of survivability, and the sin I am of course referring to is all 3 Umbral mods. Fortunately, all 3 Umbral mods have given me enough power strength from Umbral Intensify, so we aren't using any other power strength mod, we're just using Umbral Intensify for the 77% power strength. All power strength is really doing on this build is the extra damage vulnerability from the Death's Harvest effect from Death's Harvest itself, as the actual nuke setup doesn't scale off power strength. The reason why I would highly advise against using all 3 Umbral mods is because they use up a lot of mod space, both capacity and mod slots, and armor in most cases is not worth modding for, as there are better forms of survivability, and there are also typically better ways of getting health, that being Arcane Blessing, and the extra armor and health you get from, or extra strength you get from Intensify from all 3 are not worth it. Additionally, Fiber and Vitality, unlike Umbral Intensify, do not give additional health or armor by themselves, while Umbral Intensify gets 44% strength in compared to the 30% strength that regular Intensify does. So Umbral Intensify is basically primed Intensify. Umbral Vitality and Fiber do not work the same. Unfortunately, I have been forced to use these 2 mods in tandem with Umbral Intensify just to get some basic survivability with this frame, giving us 900 health and 100 armor. We are also using Adaptation. Yes, seriously, this thing still dies with Adaptation and Umbral Fiber and Arcane Reaper, which will give us additional armor and health regen over time on melee kill. I would highly recommend maxing this out for the 24 24 health per second regen you get, as well as the 660 armor you get on melee kill. I just haven't been able to farm up enough of Arcane Reaper to max it out. Natural Talents is actually used because the casting animation of Death's Harvest is quite slow and will get you killed even with Natural Talent. So we definitely want Natural Talent for casting speed, and all 5 of our Archon Shards are already filled just to make this thing work. So, which I'll get to in a second. Stretch for extra range for Death's Harvest, Equilibrium for energy economy, and also same with Prime Flow and Arcane Energize. And then we are using Rush of all things in our Exalted slot because it feels so clunky to play as the Shadow without any sprint speed. As I said, I would get to the Archon Shards. All 5 of these Archon Shards, which I use on all 3 of my builds as I use the same Sevagoth, are specifically and only for the Exalted Shadow for the Shadow Nuke build. The 2 Amber Shards are used for maximum energy on spawn. This means so we can actually use our abilities when we spawn into the Shadow. If you're not going to use these Amber Shards, I would highly recommend using Preparation on the Shadow. The other 3 are, again, I have committed a sin just to make this damn thing work and have basic survivability. All 3 of them are Tau Forged Health Regen over Time Shards, meaning 7.5 for each of them, giving me 22.5 health regen per second for each of them collectively, and that is on top of the health regen per second we get from Arcane Reaper. And I still have some survivability issues with this build, but most of the time I manage to survive until the death well runs out. So all of this was just to get basic survivability going. Oh, and yeah, we are also using Healing Return on the Claw for extra health regen just to make this dude live. So the Shadow Claws are, of course, Healing Return, as I already explained. Condition Overload for the base damage. Sacrificial Steel, as we can't use Blood Rush, for crit chance. Sacrificial Steel is basically Primed Steel, so do use Sacrificial Steel over Primed Steel. Melee Power S, as we can't use Weeping Runes for status chance. We got our crit damage from Organ Shatter. We got our faction damage, and we have our fire attack speed from Berserker Fury. We are using Volcanic Edge for some additional status chance, and also Heat as just for some damage over time / extra status effects for Healing Return. And also Heat does apply Panic on enemies, giving us some crowd control. However, I would recommend using the Electric 60/60 mod if you have it, which I don't, because Electric will be a better source of damage and crowd control. So Diriga is the companion we are using for this setup for 2 reasons, both for energy economy as well as priming. We get priming from Manifold Bond, as Manifold Bond applies the stats effects of our companion's weapon onto enemies within range each time it casts an ability. This works specifically well on Diriga because of Arc Coil, which is a Diriga ability which only has a 5-second cooldown, and Manifold Bond will lower the cooldown of that by 3 seconds each time we kill an enemy with 3 or more status effects, effectively allowing us to spam Arc Coil. Which is also how we get energy economy with this build with Mystic Bond, as Mystic Bond will give us 1 free Warframe ability cast every 5 companion casts, and Manifold Bond and Arc Coil together allow Arc Coil to basically be spammed, allowing it so we rarely actually have to use energy to cast our abilities. And yes, this is needed to give basic energy economy for this build, I swear. Maximus Bond is used to give us additional priming, as when we kill an Xmas unit, we do get an extra status effect for our companion, which will give us another status effect for priming. And if our companion is downed, killing an Xmas will lower the recovery time by 18 seconds. Primed regen so our companion has less time when it's downed. Enhanced Vitality, Calculator Redirection for basic survivability. Vacuum is a must-have, and Synth Deconstruct is, of course, just a very nice utility mod to have. And this is a flex mod, put whatever you want in it. I couldn't either way because I don't have the mod capacity for it, but that can be arranged with simple form. The weapon we are using is the Verglas. The Verglas does only do electricity damage, but we have modded it to also do viral and radiation. We do have critical delay on it for other builds, but we don't have to worry about that for this build. Basically, we have viral radiation and electricity because electricity stuns enemies, which is crowd control. Radiation will make enemies shoot other enemies, which is crowd control, both of which give us additional survivability for our Shadow, and of course Viral will increase the damage we do to enemies, and also all three of them will act as additional status effects for both Healing Return and also Condition Overload. And the utility weapons literally don't matter for this build at all because the Shadow doesn't benefit from them anyway. The focus school for all three builds is entirely up to you. As I said, the focus school for the Shadow build, Nuke build doesn't matter because the Shadow doesn't benefit from focus school passives anyway. However, for all three of the builds, well, it doesn't matter for the last one, but for the first two builds, both Sevagoth builds, I do use Yunaru. I use Yunaru for the knockback resistance on both builds. If you do not have Yunaru, I would highly recommend using Prime Sure-Footed instead, especially on the Nuke build, as it is a shield gate build and knockback resistant immunity is needed to survive on a shield gate build. So if you're not using Yunaru for knockback immunity on the shield gate build, use Prime Sure-Footed. If you do have Prime Sure-Footed, then you can use any of the focus schools. If you want additional energy economy, chuck on Zeneric, Vazgrin for survivability, Matarek for extra damage, Naramon might be useful, don't use Naramon. For the health tank build, I'm also using Yunaru for the knockback resistance, and also I do benefit from extra armor from Yunaru, but it's not as needed, so you could use any of the other ones if you wanted. Zeneric won't really be as useful when it comes to the health tank build, the weapon platform build, as Gloom is a channeled ability which overrides the energy regen we get from Zeneric. But Vazgrin's extra survivability, as well as Matarai's extra damage and casting speed and power strength, will also still be very useful for the health tank weapon platform build, so use either of the three of these you want. Naramon won't be useful, don't use it. Anyway, I know that was a longer video. 3 builds is a lot to get through, and Sevagoth himself is also a lot to get through. But I do hope you enjoyed this video. As I said, it took a lot to get done. I had to rearrange the settings in my audio setup, my recording setup, and also I had to do a lot of testing because the wiki actually has quite small amounts of information on Sevagoth and how his shadow works and the nuances and all that stuff. Anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to me, and as I really do appreciate the support you give me. And also check out some of my other videos, leave a like on this video, and also comment below. And until next time, bye bye.